Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. Late last year, we explored several NHL drafts of the last few decades and highlighted how their sizable quantity of successful prospects made each of these events some of the best drafts in recent memory. Now in the comments of those videos, several people suggested that I take a look at the 1979 draft too, and having recently delved deeper into the event, oh my goodness were you guys right. Whether it was the plethora of players who lived up to the hype, the numerous picks who far surpassed expectations, or a league legend taken 8th overall, the 1979 draft is one of, if not the greatest draft in the history of the National Hockey League. But why was this draft so successful? Which players were taken, and how did their careers pan out? Well, let's take a closer look at the event and find out, shall we? So in today's video, join me as we explore why the 1979 NHL entry draft was an overwhelming success. Now in order to highlight just how legendary this draft was, let's look at all the first round picks that clearly panned out in the many years after their selection. And to do that, let's work our way from the latest selection of the round all the way to the very top of the draft. Are you ready guys? Because I know I am. Kicking things off, we have the 21st overall pick by the Edmonton Oilers, Kevin Lowe. One of the most decorated players of his draft class, Kevin Lowe would go on to play 1,254 NHL games over parts of 19 seasons after his selection, where he scored 84 goals and 431 points during that span. Now while he was known more for his defensive play than his offensive numbers, the Canadian defenseman would earn more trophies than most during his career, as he lifted 6 Stanley Cup championships, 5 of which with the Edmonton Oilers and 1 with the New York Rangers, and he also took home the 1990 King Clancy Trophy too. Winning the greatest trophy in the sport once is difficult enough, but doing so on 6 different occasions is simply incredible. Safe to say that Lowe worked out pretty well for the Oilers, didn't he? Next up, we have the 20th overall pick by the Quebec Nordiques, Michel Goulet. One of the most productive players of this draft, Michel Goulet would spend parts of 15 seasons in the show, split between the Nordiques and the Chicago Blackhawks, where he potted 548 goals and 1,152 points in just 1,089 regular season games. Though he wouldn't earn any individual awards during his NHL career, the Canadian forward is the first of 3 players in this video to have reached the 1,000 point plateau, and he is the only player to have scored at over a point a game pace for his entire NHL career. Oh, and he would also be named to the league's first All-Star team 3 times, the second All-Star team twice, he won the Canada Cup in 1988, and he was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1999, which sounds like a pretty amazing career if you ask me. Moving on to the 17th pick by the New York Islanders, we have Duane Sutter. Another player who won his fair share of silverware, Duane Sutter played 731 NHL games over parts of 11 seasons, split between the Islanders and the Chicago Blackhawks, scoring 139 goals and 342 points in the process. Now while his NHL career wasn't nearly as long, and while his overall numbers weren't as great as the previous 2 players we've looked at, the Canadian forward would make up for it in his trophy cabinet, as he would lift 4 consecutive Stanley Cup championships, all with the New York Islanders, between 1980 and 1983. There's certainly worse ways to make your mark, that's for sure. Now we have the 16th overall pick by the LA Kings, Jay Wells. The least productive player of this group, Jay Wells spent parts of 18 seasons in the show, where he notched 47 goals and 263 points in 1,098 games. Though he was a defensive defenseman who had no problem dropping the gloves, the Canadian blue liner would also get his hands on the greatest trophy in the sport, as he lifted the 1994 Stanley Cup as a member of the New York Rangers. His career wasn't nearly as decorated as some of the other picks from this draft class, but you don't play over 1,000 games in the NHL if you're a bad hockey player now, do you? Shifting over to the 15th pick by the Boston Bruins, we have Brad McCrimmon. One of the longest tenured players of this draft class, Brad McCrimmon suited up in 1,222 NHL games over parts of 18 seasons, where he scored 81 goals and 403 points during that span. Now while his trophy cabinet would be far more modest than some of the other players in this video, the Canadian defenseman would earn his fair share of accolades too, as he was an NHL All-Star in 1988, he was named to the second All-Star team that same year, and he won the 1989 Stanley Cup as a member of the Calgary Flames. God, there's been a lot of cup winners so far, hasn't there? Next, we have the 14th overall pick by the Philadelphia Flyers, Brian Propp. A high-scoring forward throughout his career, Brian Propp would play parts of 15 seasons in the league, where he potted 425 goals and 1,004 points in 1,016 NHL games. Despite the lack of silverware during his NHL career, the Canadian forward would still earn several awards, as he scored the most points by a rookie during the 1979-80 season, and he won the 1988 Canada Cup as a member of Team Canada. That said, scoring at roughly a point-a-game pace for a decade and a half sounds like a pretty successful career to me, folks. On to the 13th pick by the New York Rangers, we have Doug Sulliman. A reliable middle six forward throughout his career, Doug Sulliman would play 631 NHL games over parts of 11 seasons, where he scored 160 goals and 328 points for his efforts. Though he wouldn't earn any accolades or get his hands on an award, the Canadian forward would reach the 20-goal plateau 5 times over a 6-year span, so he certainly could have done a lot worse for himself, you know. Now we have the 12th overall pick by the Atlanta Flames, Paul Reinhart. A productive blue liner during his tenure in the show, Paul Reinhart would spend parts of 11 seasons in the NHL, split between the Flames and the Vancouver Canucks, where he notched 133 goals and 559 points in 648 regular season games. Now, while he wouldn't earn any trophies during this span, the Canadian defenseman would register 5 seasons of 60 points or more, and he would score the most goals by a defenseman during the 1986 playoffs with 5, so he clearly knew how to put his name on the box score, right? Next up, we have the 11th pick by the Buffalo Sabres, Mike Ramsey. Another player to reach the 1,000 game mark, Mike Ramsey would play 1,070 NHL games over parts of 18 seasons with the Sabres, the Pittsburgh Penguins and the Detroit Red Wings, scoring 79 goals and 345 points in the process. Though his career statistics were far more modest than some of the other members of his draft class, the American defenseman would earn an Olympic gold medal in 1980, and he would be inducted into both the Buffalo Sabres and the United States Hockey Hall of Fame in 2002. Not bad, Ramsey, not bad at all. We've reached the top 10 picks of the draft order, and while we've already highlighted some incredible NHL careers, several of these upcoming players would go down in history as some of the greatest players the league has ever seen. Let's start with the 9th overall pick by the Toronto Maple Leafs, Laurie Boschman. The latest selection to spend considerable time in the show, Laurie Boschman would spend parts of 14 seasons in the NHL, where he potted 229 goals and 577 points in 1,009 regular season games. Despite failing to earn any awards or accolades during this span, the Canadian forward would reach the 20-goal mark 4 times, score 70 points twice, and he would spend over a decade in the best league in the world, so he had a pretty solid career all things considered. Moving on to the 8th overall pick by the Boston Bruins, we have none other than Raymond Bourque. The greatest player of his draft class by a pretty sizable margin, Raymond Bourque would play a whopping 1,612 NHL games over parts of 22 seasons, split between the Bruins and the Colorado Avalanche, where he scored an incredible 410 goals and 1,579 points during that span. Now, if his career statistics weren't impressive enough, the Canadian defenseman would also take home an insane amount of awards, including 5 Norris trophies, the 1980 Calder Trophy, a King Clancy Trophy, and a Lester Patrick Trophy. And that's not even mentioning his 13 first All-Star team nods, his 6 second team berths, his 19 consecutive trips to the NHL All-Star Game, and the 2001 Stanley Cup, which he won with Colorado during his final year in the league. Oh, and he has also set numerous Bruins franchise records, and he was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2005, just in case his previous accolades weren't impressive enough. I think Bourque's career went pretty well, don't you? Now we have the 7th overall pick by the Chicago Blackhawks, Keith Brown. A reliable defenseman throughout his career, Keith Brown would spend 16 seasons in the league, split between the Blackhawks and the Florida Panthers, where he scored 68 goals and 342 points in 876 games. Though he wouldn't earn any awards during this span, the Canadian defenseman would reach the 40-point mark twice, he had a career plus-minus of +64, and he wore an A on his jersey during the 89-90 season, so he clearly earned his keep as a steady presence on the back end. Next, we have the 6th overall pick by the Minnesota North Stars, Craig Hartsburg. The least experienced NHL player in this video, Craig Hartsburg would play 570 NHL games over parts of 10 seasons exclusively with the North Stars, where he scored 98 goals and 413 points during that span. Now, while he would have the shortest career of any player so far, the Canadian defenseman would serve as captain of the North Stars for 7 seasons, he would earn 3 trips to the NHL All-Star Game, and he would produce a lengthy coaching career in the 3 decades after his retirement. Sounds like a pretty successful tenure if you ask me. Shifting over to the 5th overall pick by the Vancouver Canucks, we have Rick Vaive. A productive forward who wasn't afraid to drop the gloves, Rick Vaive spent parts of 13 seasons in the league, where he potted 441 goals and 788 points in 876 regular season games. Though he wouldn't earn any silverware during his NHL career, the Canadian forward would score 50 goals or more on 3 separate occasions. He served as captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs for 4 seasons, and he was a 3-time All-Star too. Spending nearly a decade and a half in the best league in the world and putting up solid numbers year in year out is something most players dream of, so good job, Vaive. On to the 4th overall pick by the Washington Capitals, we have none other than Mike Gartner. One of the highest scoring players of his draft class, Mike Gartner suited up in 1,432 NHL games over parts of 19 seasons, where he scored an incredible 708 goals and 1,335 points for his efforts. Now, if his scoring numbers weren't impressive enough, the Canadian forward would earn 7 trips to the All-Star Game, he would wear an A on his jersey for 6 seasons, and he would be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2001. Silverware or not, Mike Gartner was a goal-scoring machine, guys. Now we have the 3rd overall pick by the Detroit Red Wings, Mike Foligno. Yet another player to reach 1,000 games, Mike Foligno would spend parts of 15 seasons in the NHL, where he potted 355 goals and 727 points in the process. While he wasn't able to earn any accolades during that span, the Canadian forward would score the most goals by a rookie during the 1979-80 season, he was a finalist for the Calder Trophy that very same year, and he was inducted into the Buffalo Sabres Hall of Fame in 2002. Given that he played a decade and a half in the show, and given that he produced consistent scoring numbers throughout, I think he had a pretty good career, you know. Penultimately, we have the 2nd overall pick by the St. Louis Blues, Perry Turnbull. One of the shorter careers of this group, Perry Turnbull played 608 NHL games over parts of 9 seasons, where he notched 188 goals and 351 points for his efforts. Though he wouldn't earn any awards during his NHL career, the Canadian forward would reach the 30-goal mark 3 times, he would score 50 points or more twice, and he would rack up 1,245 penalty minutes in the process. So he made good friends with the penalty box while he was at it too. And finally, last but by no means least, we have the 1st overall pick by the Colorado Rockies, Rob Ramage. The premier pick of this draft class, Rob Ramage spent parts of 15 seasons in the NHL, where he scored 139 goals and 564 points in 1,044 regular season games. Not only would he spend a decade and a half in the show, the Canadian defenseman would earn several awards during this span, as he earned 4 trips to the NHL All-Star Game, and he won a pair of Stanley Cup championships too, one with the Calgary Flames in 1989, and the other with the Montreal Canadiens in 1993. Given that he produced a long and successful career in the show, and given that he has spent the last 6 seasons as the Habs Director of Player Development, Ramage may not have been the best player of his draft class, but he certainly lived up to the hype. Now, it's worth mentioning that I've only highlighted the picks that suited up in at least 500 NHL games during their careers, and we still ended up discussing 18 different players. In fact, of the 21 selections in the first round of the 1979 draft, 13 picks played at least 750 games, 11 played at least 1,000 games, while 3 played at least 1,250 games. If that doesn't show you just how incredible this draft class was, I don't know what will. While the first round had a lot of great selections, there were plenty of legendary players that were also taken during the later rounds too. For example, Brent Ashton, Dave Christian and Dale Hunter are some of the many superstars that were taken in the second round. Neil Broughton, Guy Carbonneau and Marc Messier are some of the best players from the third round, while Glenn Anderson, John Odgrodnik, Thomas Steen and Doug Crossman were some of the most notable names from the later rounds too. In fact, of the 105 players taken between rounds 2 and 6, 26 of them played at least 500 NHL games, 14 played at least 750 games, while 6 of them played over 1,000 regular season games. Given that later round picks have a lower chance of making it to the show, let alone sticking around for an extended period of time, the fact that so many of them spent so long in the league proves that this class was very, very deep. So based on what we've discovered in this video, I think we can all agree that the 1979 NHL entry draft was a complete success. After all, not only did many of the top prospects reach expectations and then some, a sizable number of later round picks would also produce legendary careers in the show. Because of this, the 1979 draft has earned a special place in the league's record books, as it's gone down in history as one of, if not the greatest draft that the National Hockey League has ever seen. Just look at all of the picks that reach 1,000 games and look at how many players have been inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Whichever way you look at it, this draft was simply iconic. Some selections didn't pan out, and some players lasted far longer than others, but compared to all the other drafts both before and since, 1979 stands head and shoulders above the competition. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was a look at why the 1979 NHL entry draft was absolutely legendary. What do you guys think about this draft or the players that were taken? Do you agree that it's one of the best drafts in NHL history, or did your favourite team make some selections that they would quickly regret? Do let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys think. But thank you very much for watching, guys, I hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye! A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.